My name is Jim Ludis. I am the Executive Director of the Pell Center and Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Salve Regina University. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to this event tonight. I think it will be a great one. We're taking a look back at 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan and trying to take stock of where we are as a country, as an international community, after 20 years of conflict. We've got two great speakers. I'll introduce them in a moment. I want to say a few quick words about ground rules for tonight and the way this will actually work. I also want to just take a moment to do a little plug for some of our upcoming events. So tonight we are virtual, but in a couple of weeks we're planning to be in person for a lecture on critical race theory and the end of myth making into America's fear of truth-telling. This is with David Stovall, who's a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. That'll be a provocative conversation. Seating is limited, so we hope that if you're going to attend that, you'll register early. I would note that for all events on campus at Salve Regina University right now, you do need to plan to wear a mask. You won't be admitted without one. Shortly after that, on November 9th, 2021, another virtual event, the presentation of the 2021 Pell Center Prize for Story in the Public Square, which is being awarded this year to Michael Paul Williams, a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who in 2019 wrote a series of columns that profoundly alter the discussion of Civil War memorials in the South. He's a remarkable writer, and we're thrilled to be able to honor him. And then on December 1st, our last event for the semester. Currently, we're still planning to do it in person, but it's titled The End of the Evil Empire, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with another great lineup of speakers. And we'll look forward to hopefully welcoming all of you either in person or virtually to that event as well. Our event tonight features two of my favorite scholars of national security issues. Dr. Hayat Alvi is Associate Professor of National Security Affairs at the Naval War College, and Dr. Mark Jacobson is the Assistant Dean of Washington Programs at Syracuse University. You've got their full bios, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into them at great depth, but they're great friends of the Pell Center, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome both of them to this event tonight. One last quick note, the way this is going to work is that I'm going to engage Hayat and Mark in a little bit of conversation to get things started. If you've got a question or a comment you want to make, post it in the comment section on Facebook. Literally just click comment, type your question. I'll be monitoring those and curating those as the conversation progresses, and I'll work them into the conversation. But we really hope this is an opportunity for the entire community to share some reflections, share some thoughts, and to elucidate some feedback and reaction. So Hayat and Mark, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Hayat, let's start with you. 9/11 is a sort of one of those moments in history where everybody sort of remembers where they were and what they were doing. Where were you and what were you doing on 9/11?
Well, first, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be interacting with the Pell Center. And also, a real quick disclaimer, everything I say will represent my personal views. I will never forget, I had just landed in Cairo, Egypt, fresh out of my PhD from Washington, D.C. And 12 days after I landed in Cairo as an assistant professor in the political science department at the American University in Cairo, 12 days just trying to get settled in, and the news broke about 9/11. Literally, I had just finished teaching that day. I was in my office, just wrapped things up, packed my things, was heading home. And at the time, the AUC campus was in the downtown area of Cairo. And at the time, the AUC campus walking distance from Tahrir Square. So as I left, I realized, because I'm new in my new apartment, I need some electrical equipment, like, extension wires and things like that. So right next to the campus was an electronics shop. And when I walked past it to just look in the window to see if it's ideal for what I'm looking for, their TV sets were on and I could see through the window CNN International, and on the bottom was a ticker that was going on. And all they were saying was, and again, this is like 5 o'clock in the evening, Cairo time, US State Department car bombed. I thought that was very strange. And I didn't even have a TV in the apartment. So I had to go back to my office on campus and get on the computer. And all the internet sites like New York Times, Washington Post were jammed. But eventually I got through and learned what exactly happened. So initially there was a lot of inaccuracies in terms of reporting, but eventually when I got through online, I learned what happened. And a couple of my colleagues joined me in my office, and we were just horrified, absolutely horrified. And we felt it was something surreal. We couldn't even believe it. So the short of it is that we were very grateful to have a stupendous expat community there that was, along with the emotions, and we were all in tears. We were all frightened about what's next. But the expat community, including the provost of the university, the president of the university, they all were so supportive. And we had to hold off classes for at least a week. When we returned, we were able to resume classes, but being in political science, we had to talk a little bit about it with the students. But most noteworthy is that as we began the semester, we could just enter the campus. When 9/11 happened, they set up ID checks and metal detectors. So in short, that's what happened.
Yeah. Now, so Mark, Hayat was thousands of miles away. It was a little bit more immediate of an experience for you. Can you share that with us?
Sure, a little bit closer. Morning of 9/11, I was a little bit late to work at the Pentagon. I had actually been on the West Coast that weekend, having discussions about terrorism of all things, and the European perspective versus the US perspective. So I was, those of you who know Washington, D.C., I was on Washington Boulevard, headed to Pentagon South parking, about 8:45, 8:46 a.m. I start hearing the first reports on the radio of a quote, small plane hitting the Trade Center. And I thought, is this a rerun? What's going on? I don't remember anything happening recently. And then the national news broke in, and a chill went down my spine. My sister, who's a broadcast journalist, was working on the West Coast at the time, and I called her right away, and I said, it's 5 a.m. there or whatever. I said, you've got to go into the office right now. She said, what are you talking about? I said, we're under attack. We're at war. She said, what are you talking about? And I explained, and she's like, well, that's one plane. And I'm like, look, you don't understand. There's no doubt of what this is. I don't remember at what point I thought bin Laden. What I was thinking about at the time was the attempt to hijack flights over the Pacific and blow them up, and some planned attacks on CIA with small planes. But anyway, it's funny. I was just looking at the timeline again. I guess I must have driven pretty quickly and ran into the Pentagon, because at that I got into my chair. It must have been 15 minutes or so. And usually that's a giant long walk from South Parking into the Pentagon, because I was at my chair when the second plane hit at 9:03, and we were all around my boss's desk a minute later, all watching this, and it was very, at this point it was very clear, and the question was, what do we do? And I worked at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I worked in a branch called Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict. I had just come from a rotation working terrorism issues, and I was working counter narcotics issues. But I remember saying to a colleague of mine, hey, speaking to my colleague, saying, listen, I'll ask my boss, I'll come down and help you all. It's going to be really busy down there. I don't think we understood yet the enormity of what was going on. About 9:35 or so, I was getting ready to go to our front office, my boss's office, to go pick up the morning intelligence reports. Usually we pick them up earlier, but obviously things were going on. and my phone rang, and it was a dear friend of mine who I've known my whole life, who's in the same field. And he said, "Hey, what do you think?" And we started talking about it. How would you do it? What would you do? Would you do it all at once? Who do you think it is? And by then we were clearly talking Bin Laden, Al Qaeda. And I hung up the phone, and it seemed like the world exploded around us, around me. The little Dilbert cubicles in our office, some of them were, falling down. Everything was rattled. You could feel the overpressure of the blast. And my first thought was a bomb had gone off like right outside our office, that someone had snuck in. In retrospect, all the signs were there. You could, a minute later, you could smell the jet fuel. You could, you realize from the smoke coming down the hallways, and just near our office, about 100 feet away, everything was collapsed. I managed to get myself and my office, so we all got out. Fortunately, no one was physically injured. No one was killed. But out on that, we were right near the helicopter pad, again, about 120 feet from impact. But we were extremely lucky. You could see the pieces of the plane out there. There was no doubt. And all of a sudden, all the pieces come together. Hayat talked about misinformation or things that, you're hearing. We heard, minutes later, there was a plane crashed into the State Department. A car bomb went off here. Really, the next thing I remember was the two F-16s that flew over, at about 100 feet, 200 feet, loudest thing I'd ever heard. And it was a good feeling. It was a good feeling. We knew that they were there to protect us. That was a long day. And I would say that, you hear stories, especially at the 20th anniversary, of people whose career paths changed. They decided that day or the next few days they wanted to go into public service. Obviously, I was already there, but there is nothing in my professional life or personal life, really, that has not been directly impacted by that day until now. And that includes things that I had to do or I chose to do this August, seeing when my friends and their families needed to get out of Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul.
Well, we're going to get to the fall of Kabul in a few minutes. I want to talk a little bit about the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. So by early October of 2001, the United States was at war on the ground in Afghanistan, first with teams led by the CIA, then ultimately American Marines and U.S. Army. Were there any other options to invasion? Was it from a policy perspective? And Hayat, let's start with you. Were there any other options that could have credibly been pursued other than the options that the Bush administration opted to choose?
I think, given the magnitude of the attacks and the issue of sending a message to any terrorists out there that this can never be repeated again, and the fact that the international community supported us along with Article 5 of NATO for collective security, I don't think it would have been viable. However, in my personal opinion, I think one of the biggest mistakes we made was to create a partnership with the Northern Alliance. I think that was a big mistake because the Northern Alliance are not credible in terms of creating a power sharing Afghanistan, and we see the results later that would have been upholding integrity and commitments to democracy and human rights. That being said, it's a very complex issue, Jim, and I'm not sure what the alternative would have been other than possibly just showing our might, going in unilaterally without Northern Alliance, but with coalition support, and going after Al Qaeda and the Taliban as we did, but without the Northern Alliance, in my opinion.
And just for the folks, I know we've got a number of students for whom this is ancient history.
Yes.
The Northern Alliance, just refresh people's memory about who they were and the role that
Yes.
their leaders ultimately played in the future of Afghanistan.
Certainly, and it is an important, history plays such an important role in anything, but especially in these events, especially leading up to 9/11 attacks. So the Northern Alliance, or NA, as we like to create abbreviations and acronyms, was led at the time by Ahmed Shah Massoud, and he was a Tajik, which is an ethnic minority in Afghanistan. The majority are Pashtun Afghans, if you know a little bit about the ethnic makeup of Afghanistan. And the Taliban are Pashtun, okay? So let's put that aside for a second. So now you can tell that the NA and the Taliban are opposing forces. And that's one of the logical reasons why we created that partnership with the NA, because after the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan by 1990, right, late 1980s, what happened in Afghanistan was that all of these warring parties and warlords and militias turned their guns against each other. And they created these factions. And one major faction was the NA, the Northern Alliance. And later, what emerged was the Taliban. And again, they were made up of these ethnic compositions. And those are important. They play a major role in what happens in Afghan politics. The Northern Alliance, at the time of the Civil War, and this is very important, was defeated quite badly by the Taliban. And they were pushed up into the northeastern part or corner of Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in 1996. Now, they had a constant arch rivalry between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, but clearly by 1996, the Taliban, quote unquote, won the civil war, especially since they took over Kabul, right? And then fast forward to 2 days before September 11th attacks. And what happens is through Al-Qaeda, a team of pseudo reporters asked for an interview on camera with Ahmed Shah Massoud, the leader, the hero of the Northern Alliance. And he was known as a war hero. He was very much revered by a lot of anti-Taliban Afghans. When he agreed to that interview, the pseudo reporters came to him and started the interview, and it was actually an assassination. They were suicide attackers, and they took out Ahmed Shah Massoud. So he was killed. The hero of Northern Alliance was killed. And because it was Al-Qaeda, you can connect that linkage to the Taliban, because again, the arch enemy of the Taliban was the Northern Alliance. You can think about it in retrospect that that was a very tactical move on the part of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in order to get the NA out of the way so that they can carry out the 9/11 attacks 2 days later. And the last point is, I remember seeing the headlines 2 days prior about Ahmed Shah Massoud being assassinated. And I scratched my head thinking, that's very curious. There's something weird about this, right? The timing of it, the target of the assassination, and then lo and behold, 2 days later, it was September 11th.
Mark, you were working, if I remember correctly, you were a presidential management intern, right?
Had just finished.
But so you're working in the office of Secretary of Defense. Do you believe that if there had been a Gore administration as a result of the 2000 presidential campaign, the contested 2000 presidential campaign, instead of a Bush administration, would the American policy response after 9/11 had been any different?
I don't think so at all. I think, in fact, for two reasons, one functional, one political. I think it was already clear that the Clinton administration, whether or not they took effective action or not, did understand bin Laden was a threat. A number of organizations at the Department of Defense that felt sidelined between January 2001 and September 11th had been trying to brief senior officials on the threat that bin Laden posed. In fact, Richard Clark, the senior director for counterterrorism at the time. I think he and his team would have given the same advice. And I think in terms of in a political sense, sometimes Democrats are seen as softer. So I think they would almost have been encouraged to strike harder. And I think this gets to your previous question about, was there anything else we could have done? I think later, yes. At the time, absolutely not. In fact, I think we held back to some degree because there was Rumsfeld and others had the view, they tried to look back at history to get some lessons. Unfortunately, they misunderstood the history and got the wrong lessons. They said, look, if we're going to go into Afghanistan, we need to have a light footprint. What we need to do is just go in there with a light footprint. We don't want to push on the xenophobia and like the British did, or like the Soviets didn't, be seen as occupiers, then we're going to get out. I think they misread the situation. I think they misunderstood. And Hayat is much better equipped than I am to discuss the internal politics of the Northern Alliance versus the Taliban. But from a military perspective, I don't really see any other options in working with the Northern Alliance. So I don't see that the shape of the initial phases of the war until you get to Bonn would have been any different under either administration. And I'm not even sure that what happened next, which something I think is one of the first big mistakes, not having equal footing for the Taliban and for the Pashtuns really, and for the Tajiks and Uzbeks and others at the table. I think that was the first big mistake, not giving the Taliban a seat at the peace talks. But I'm not sure Gore would have handled that differently.
When you say the peace talks, you're talking about the Loya Jirga?
Yeah, the Loya Jirga, the meetings in Bonn. There's a good argument to be made that at that point, in fact, the Taliban, said so much. Look, we'll sit down and the war's over. We'll go have a seat at the table. I mean, if we didn't know it then, we certainly should understand now that the deals about the end of the war are cut before the end of the war. Just if you kind of look at the last couple of months, the deals that were cut with the various warlords, Ismail Khan and his militia comes to mind. These were done before the Taliban roll into Kabul. And I think in the same way, we should have let some of this play out. But as Americans often do, we picked our favorites. The best English speaker we were dealing with, Karzai, the one we knew, the one the CIA had connections with. Let's work it that way. This is our person. We know how to deal with them. And I just think that what we misunderstood was sometimes you have to sit down at the table with people who have the blood of your friends on their hands in order to have real peace. This is what the Brits learn in Northern Ireland. This is what the Colombians learn in their peace talks with the FARC. But again, there are many mistakes over the 20 years. But I think a big political one is this failure to have the Taliban, at the table at the time when really they were in a position of weakness, greater weakness than they would have been than they were 10 years ago or certainly today.
So I guess the question that I want to ask from that so the American public, I think, was expecting a day where the Taliban would cease to be a threat in Afghanistan, and that the democracy would come to Afghanistan, and then that would be the course of we would have won, right? That's when the war would be over.
I agree with the big concept. The American public wanted to see the surrender agreement on the battleship Missouri. I mean, how many times did we hear politicians say, whether it was Dick Cheney or John Kerry, look, this isn't going to, you're not going to see a surrender agreement, with the signing on the deck of the battleship Missouri. The problem is most Americans' conceptualization of war, because of our culture, is that one side wins, one side loses. They forget, the old adage, and I think it's Henry Kissinger who said, look, there's no end state in foreign policy. You keep going. It's not like, hey, we're all done here. The State Department can close and the Department of Defense can close. It's like disease. There's always going to be disease. And you keep having to work through these problems. And I think we forget, in fact, the way to approach counterterrorism, I still believe, including Afghanistan, and how to deal with Al-Qaeda was really sort of a quasi-law enforcement approach with a military supports. In fact, I just said to someone earlier today, if you want to look back at the 20 years at some of the big mistakes, consider that we did not have the U.S. Agency for International Development, who are the experts on combating violent extremism, in the lead, and where they have support are those times where they need the Department of Defense to go bomb people, which the Department of Defense is very good at. So I think that the conceptualization that we had the overarching failure of the war was due to the fact that the White House, our senior political leaders in Congress, our opinion leaders, our key opinion leaders, and the American people thought this was going to be like a football game. We're going to score more points, and that's it. It's over. We won. We can move on to the next thing. And that's a complete misreading of 2,000 years of history and conflict. Not in Afghanistan. I'm talking globally.
Yeah.
A misreading of that.
So I just want to remind folks that I could talk to both Hayat and Mark all night, and I will, unless you give me a reason not to. So if you've got questions or comments, please make sure you post them in the comment section on Facebook Live, and I'll curate those and make sure we get them. Hayat, I want to ask you though. So 9/11, obviously September 2001. 18 months later, the United States is at war in Iraq. How much did the war in Iraq alter the course of the war in Afghanistan? Or can we even make that kind of comparison?
In terms of whatever kind of policy, objective, and or mission we were trying to achieve in Afghanistan, in my view, they were 100% derailed in effectiveness by focusing attention or shifting attention to Iraq 2003. And again, we do a lot of retrospection on that, and I think there's a lot of public opinion that has changed as of close to 20 years later after that 2003 invasion of Iraq, that that was not really a necessary war. I think that we have yet to have some sort of solid explanation as to why we did that, and also what was the rationale in shifting attention away from Afghanistan beyond the kind what I call the laser focus of counterterrorism, which was ongoing in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq eventually. But it really took our attention away from really what we should have been focused on in I would say 100% with all of our resources on just Afghanistan. I would venture to guess, had we done that and not gone into Iraq, we would also have gotten out of Afghanistan sooner, presumably.
Elaborate on that. Why do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I don't believe it. I'm guessing on that, only because we would have invested all of our resources on achieving what our main objectives and goals were in Afghanistan quite exclusively, rather than reshifting all of that to the Iraq campaign. And therefore, there's a presumption there. I'm not saying with concrete definitiveness, but there's a presumption that had we done that, our effectiveness, our metrics for what we were trying to achieve in Afghanistan would have been far better had we not been diverted into Iraq.
Mark, I want to pick up on some of this because you had two different stints in Afghanistan, one in uniform as a officer in the United States Navy, and a second stint where you were the senior civilian foreign policy advisor to the commander of U.S. and NATO forces or international forces in Afghanistan. When you were there, did you feel like the war in Iraq was impacting the ability to conduct operations in Afghanistan?
I thought you were going to say, did you feel like you were winning? And then there's the old joke that, hey, when I left, we were winning, but that gets to a bigger cultural problem we can talk about in terms of why things went the way they did. In short, absolutely. I've been thinking about this in response to your question. In what ways did the war in Iraq impact the war in Afghanistan? I mean, there's a little intellectual game you can play is, would we have had as sophisticated an approach to counterinsurgency in Afghanistan circa 2009, 10, 11, when I went back, if we hadn't had that experience in Iraq? And that, it's hard to kind of, to go back and play the counterfactual. So, in some ways, the experience of Iraq may have assisted in Afghanistan, but I do think we would have come to a realization there. In fact, by 2000, so the way that it really impacts our resources, especially what's known as ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. At the time, drones were not as ubiquitous as they are today. And the few platforms that the military had to do this constant surveillance to create these patterns of life so that you can identify a particular terrorist threat or insurgent threat, the ability to put tens of thousands of special operations forces, which were really the right forces for Afghanistan, on the ground, was hampered because they were in Iraq. And I think by 2006, you started to see, especially with the British general at the time, Sir David Richards, was starting to develop these overall plans for how do we deal with this as an insurgency. So real quick, 2001, 2002, we knock out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, essentially, new governments installed. Things are actually pretty normal and quiet for a couple of years. By 2006, when I got there in the beginning of 2006, it was dangerous, but still relatively quiet. By the end, things were really ramping up and getting quite kinetic, quite deadly. And then that continued until 2008 and 2009, when the US newspapers were talking about the enemy at the gates of Kabul. There's no resources to be had. 2006, we heard this over and over again. There are no more resources. We had one brigade, 3,000 to 4,000 troops in the eastern part of Afghanistan, and had to split off a couple of companies, 200 people here, 200 people there, to go down to the south. Consider that when we have maybe 20 brigades, plus tens of thousands of support, intelligence, engineers, aviation assets when we get to the height of the surge. I mean, we're talking maybe 15, 20,000 troops in 2006. I could be off a little bit on that, but we're talking well over 100,000 US and allied troops by 2010. So no, the resources aren't there. There is an impact. I also think what's interesting is there was a transfer of knowledge, technical knowledge, between the insurgents in Iraq and the insurgents in Afghanistan. So a lot of the IED technology you see in Iraq in 2004 and 2005 makes its way to Afghanistan. But I also think that the Iraq war does additional damage to our relationship with the Iranians, which will have an impact later on, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think bottom line, it would have been a very different war without the terrible mistake of going to war in Iraq.
So what I hear from both of you, and we've got some questions from the audience, and I'm going to turn to these in just a moment, but what I'm hearing from both of you, and if I'm overstating it, please correct me, but Hayat, I hear you both saying essentially that there was, if the war had been better resourced in its earliest years, there was perhaps a path to a better outcome than where we are right now. I'm not saying victory, because I don't want to put it in that sort of black and white Manichaean perspective, but is that consistent with what your scholarship and your research says about this, that there was a path to better outcome in Afghanistan if the war had been better resourced in those earlier years?
It could have, and I have to emphasize the word could. But let me add to something that my colleague just said, and that is, having sat through this from a different perspective overseas. I was in Egypt at the time of the Iraq campaign as well. That war in Iraq, that invasion of Iraq, really hurt United States image globally and credibility, and even the legitimacy of the question of legitimacy of going into Iraq. Whereas we had the complete support of the international community for us to defend ourselves against terrorism in going into Afghanistan. So there's a difference in that as well. But then you also have, with Iraq, you have the emergence of Guantanamo and all of the the negativity that comes out of that fuels the negative image and credibility of the United States, as well as Abu Ghraib and the abuses there, as well as many other things that come out of Iraq. And again, sitting in Cairo, you won't believe the anger I heard from the public streaked basically about we don't hate the people of America, but we really hate foreign policies coming out of Washington, because this was not seen as legitimate. Afghanistan was viewed as legitimate, and had we put all of our resources and focus and attention and clarity on explaining our, as we say to our students, the ends, ways, and means of achieving those goals, right? The ends or political objectives in Afghanistan and solely in Afghanistan, then yes, there would have been far more effective outcomes. That's very likely. However, the Iraq campaign really hurt our credibility, in addition to all of the other negative factors on the ground.
Well, hi, we've got a question here from the audience that I'll start with you. And this is from Kelly Jordan, a self-identified friend of Mark, which makes me highly suspicious in the first place. But he asks about the U.S. decision to no longer retain elimination of the Taliban as a strategic objective in Afghanistan in about 2009. Can you comment on that decision? And are we talking about the Taliban back in control of Afghanistan now because of that decision?
I think I can't speak to the actual rationale that went into the decision, but I can guess that because of the realization that the Taliban are not going away, A, B, the Taliban have support from Pakistan, ISI or intelligence service in Pakistan, and therefore C, it makes the whole situation extremely complicated because the Afghan Taliban have had the benefit and the advantage of making hits in Afghanistan and then jumping over the border and having safe havens in Pakistan on the Afghan-Pakistan border region and on the Pakistan side. And then there's yet another dimension to this, and that is the rise of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which is not the same as the Afghan Taliban, but it is an indication that in the entire region, Afghanistan and Pakistan, sometimes we call it AFPAC, that in that entire region, we are seeing a mass proliferation of a Taliban-like ideology, which is beyond our control. So what I always ask is the question of how do you fight and potentially kill an ideology? It's not a tangible thing. You can fight a tangible party in a military kinetic manner, right? But you cannot kill its ideology. And in fact, by 2009 and after 2009, we actually see the proliferation and intensification of a Taliban ideology in the whole AFPAC region. So perhaps the policymakers looked at that and with the complications with Pakistan-United States relationship, there might have been realization on the part of our policymakers that we really can't put all more of our resources and shed a lot of our own troops' blood and their well-being, their health, because there are a lot of injuries as well. That cannot be sustained long-term.
Mark, in 2001, you and I were 1 year into a beautiful friendship, and we were having a lot of dinner conversations with a group that you put together to talk about America's ability to compete in the battlefield of ideas. This was before 9/11, before we were really thinking about Islamic extremism. The case that Hayat lays out just now sounds to me like the United States failed miserably to appropriately undermine the ideology at the base of the Taliban. Is that an accurate assessment? And if so, why did we fail so badly?
Yeah, I am more of a believer now than I was even 5 years ago at the depth of our failure on this. I think there are some failures that came as a result of what Hayat described in terms of our international credibility, but that has some different impacts. I mean, there's no doubt that Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, our recruitment gave a benefit to the recruitment, I think more in Iraq than Afghanistan, but you know, and those things we you know, how do you message on such a bad policy? I think a lot of these were policy failures. Didn't matter what kind of messaging you have, but where I think we really missed it, and then I want to address something you just raised, where I think we really missed it was understanding that the ideology of the Taliban had such a draw for most of the Afghan people that once, and I don't mean Sharia law, I don't mean the cultural girls not in school, I'm talking about in terms of what of ending the war and having a relationship. We're going to all sit around the table. I mean, look at the lines out of the Taliban since Kabul. No. We're going to sit down and discuss it. Look at the fact that people are saying, oh my God, there's such peace that we don't even know what to do with it right now. There's an old adage that I remember, I wish I could remember the city, Afghans told General McChrystal, this was early in or middle of 2009, essentially that, look, our first preference is for the Americans and the government to win the war and for there to be peace. Our second preference is for the Taliban to win everything and for there to be peace. What we don't want to see is you two struggling with each other over and over again because we're the ones who are going to suffer. But let me just shift a little bit to something you just said, and I want to tie your question about could we have won to Kelly's question about the strategic change in 2009. I think by 2009, because of both the experience in Iraq and in particular the Petraeus report on Iraq that he does at 2007, and the rising preeminence of General McChrystal coming out of Iraq to becoming director of the Joint Staff, and of course the discussions out at Leavenworth, Kansas about a new counterinsurgency manual. You know, I think there's a realization that you can't kill your way to victory. I have to throw in the Eisenhower quote: "You can't kill communism with a bullet." You can't do it. So what do you have in Afghanistan? You have people who support the government. You have people who are neutral. And then you have people over here who are actively working against the government. Some of those people who are actively working against the government, you can turn into fans of the government. Some you can make neutral. That's the idea behind the counterinsurgency. The view is you can't kill everybody. You want to really shrink the number of people that you have to deal with militarily. That was the goal. That was the idea, the overarching concept. So, and I think that was right. I think the problem is that, and we can get into this later, but it was a cultural problem. We had the right strategy. And I know this will rile people who say, but it didn't work. Of course it didn't work. And it wasn't just execution. It was measuring which pieces were working and which pieces aren't. One of the same problems we see during Vietnam. We measure what's measurable, which often is irrelevant. The training is a failure largely because we measured it based on how well the American troops did in training versus the combat effectiveness of the Afghans. And we can get into that whole discussion. And then thirdly, I think that we failed to be on that senior leaders, both military and civilian, failed to be honest with the American people about the amount of time this would take. I cannot tell you the number of private conversations I had with members of Congress, senior political civilian leaders, and senior military leaders where everyone agreed, yeah, this is a 10, 15, or 20-year struggle. Had only we been so honest in the beginning, we could have planned for that approach versus the 1 year, we'll be out in 2 years, we'll be out in 3 years. And we've seen this over and over again. We'll only be in Bosnia for 1 year, We'll only be in Afghanistan until we'll be home by Christmas. And you see this over and over again. So I worry that even if we would have not had Iraq, that our cultural, some real cultural problems within the US military and within our own, our government overall would have hampered our ability to get this done.
Let me go back to some of the questions from the audience here. So, and I have to note that there's a long and thoughtful comment here by Kelly Jordan, who I would not even possibly be able to do justice to its complexity.
One of the sharpest military historians I have ever worked with.
So I'm just going to encourage people to read that comment and make of it what they will. Kelly Armstrong, president at Salve, Virginia University, asks this question, though, and we'll start with you, Hayat. As educators, and your career now, Hayat, is dedicated to educating the next generation of military leaders in the United States, and Mark, yours is dedicated to educating the next generation of leaders in the outside of the military, but for government service. As educators, how can we prepare our future leaders to better understand the history behind these conflicts? What's missing in our current approach? So Hayat, let's start with you.
Oh, that's a tough one. But the first thing that comes to my mind is that we're very behind in educational refinement at the elementary to secondary school levels. And in particular, we're very bad with world history and geography. And so I think education at that very early level and stages have to take into account that if we want savvy global, US leaders in both military and civilian capacities at the global and regional and national levels, then they have to have the foundational knowledge of world history and geography, and along with many other things. But we as a country have not done well in those two areas. And I'm afraid that we're even getting more and more departed from embracing those two disciplines. And really also teaching students at a young age to think critically and analytically. We live in an age of disinformation and fake news, quote unquote. We live in an age of people having the tendency, and by people I mean grown adults, having the tendency to believe what they see and hear online or on their favorite news channel or news entertainment channels, however you want to describe them. That means we are devoid of critical thinking in very critical stages of our lives, especially for the younger folks out there. I really hope that our educational systems from the youngest on up embrace this extremely important skill of critical thinking and analytical thinking. If not, we're doomed.
Mark, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, this is something you and I have discussed and I grapple with all the time in trying to adjust a curriculum for both undergraduates and graduates who not only are going to be in the public policy arena, but are also going to teach and mentor those who come after them. And I think this is the critical thinking bit I can't stress enough. But whether it's historical literacy, civic literacy, media and digital literacy, even cultural literacy, it all comes down to critical thinking. And, I was thinking about the comment in terms of history in particular. We all have to understand that facts are facts. However, history isn't just what happened, it's what the historians say happened, right? So I think after we get through the rote learning and understanding the basic dates, we have to encourage our high school students and our undergraduates to be critical of the history we read. And I mean that in the sense of there are different interpretations. How I view 9/11 may be very different than how someone who grew up in the same neighborhood I did, went to the same schools I did, but 20 years later views 9/11. There is also this issue of sometimes I think we're afraid, this may open up a can of worms, but sometimes we're afraid that if we look at something in American history and it was wrong, then necessarily we as a nation are bad. We are horrible, bad people because we did something wrong. Whether it's something as specific as a failure in Afghanistan or something as monumental as the institution of slavery It does not necessarily mean those of us today, by studying something and being critical of it and saying they were wrong, they made poor choices, they made a mistake, they missed something. It doesn't mean necessarily, and specifically in terms of Afghanistan, that we today are bad people and all of America is bad and should be shamed forever because of that. But you sure need to study it. You need to understand it, and we need to understand it from a diverse set of perspectives. And I'll say one last comment on that, particularly with regards to understanding the military history of Afghanistan the last 20 years. If we simply read the memoirs of our flag and general officers who commanded at senior levels, we will not understand what the war was about. So if our students are going to go study Afghanistan, they need to read the narratives, not just of the soldiers who served who look like me, but the women who served. How about members of the Muslim faith who enlisted or took commissions and served in Afghanistan? You know, we need to understand how war impacts people from a variety of perspectives. And most importantly, we better read the narratives written by Afghan participants in the war, or we won't understand it. So that's a fancy way of saying, when we study the history to try and understand it better, we better look at both sides of the issue, or the multiple sides of the issue, in order to understand it.
We've got, so we're approaching the 1 hour mark, and if you guys we've got some great questions in the chat box here. We've got some other important things that I want to get to. So if you can indulge us, we might just go a little bit beyond the 1 hour mark. And I appreciate your continued participation. Hayat, Louisa Boatwright asks if you can speak generally to U.S. investments in military equipment, including drones for these wars. Has it been worth it? And given the fall of Kabul and the collapse of the Afghan government, how much of that equipment and technology has now wound up in enemy hands? Can you speak to that at all?
So the drones and equipment that we used on our side, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I can't speak to numbers, but it's large quantity, but of course they were effective, and we are at the cutting edge of the high technology in military equipment and weapons and ISR, reconnaissance and intelligence, and that kind of capabilities. So we put everything into it that every brigade needed, as far as I can tell. And I think Mark can speak more to that than I can, since I've never been in combat to full disclosure. But at the same time, we tried, this is my understanding, we tried in both Iraq, but especially in Afghanistan recently, as we were withdrawing, to either destroy or take with us whatever we could in terms of whatever was invested in supplies, equipment, and technology. But I'm going to defer to Mark because he would know more about that.
I'll do my best to answer that. What I will say is, you often hear this, some figures thrown around, that are awfully political and actually partisan. The U.S. left $85 billion worth of equipment. That's actually all the equipment we ever used in Afghanistan, including that which we took home. As I understand it, what we're really dealing with are two things. Things such as pickup trucks, some Humvees, some cargo and transport trucks, but also, and I think more importantly, the equipment we provided to the Afghan security forces: pistols, machine guns, grenade launchers, night vision goggles, uniforms even. You can see that that's in Taliban's hands. So, we're not talking about things such as drones or sensitive equipment. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that, we have to understand what was left behind. A lot of ammunition as well. And I think the number that the special inspector general for Afghan reconstruction threw out, it may have been around 18 to 20 billion was provided to the Afghan security forces since 2001. So it's got to be a number less than that. And the other thing is, some of the equipment that was left behind, you see pictures of the Black Hawk helicopters, and things like that. Those have been destroyed. I mean, they can't fly them. They can't use them. Yeah, which is one of the reasons I think you're likely to see the Chinese or the Russians start to sell equipment to the Taliban when they need it. But again, the military is pretty good about that stuff. If it's something that could be a danger to us, and I'm not talking about from a holistic perspective, but they're not going to leave a highly sensitive piece of equipment there. That stuff was taken out or destroyed, but it's not cutting edge stuff.
So we've got to spend a little time talking about how the war ended, at least how the American presence in Afghanistan ended. So Hayat, can you just for the audience sketch out sort of the end of the Afghan government and the withdrawal of American forces? How did that come about, and where does it leave us today?
It's a very painful topic, honestly, because I've been following Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion in 1979, and seeing these various iterations of conflicts and wars and invasions by various groups and parties and foreign powers is heartbreaking, to be honest, especially with regard to the cost that the Afghan civilians have paid. From 1979 to today. So this is not something that was just recent. It goes all the way back to the Soviet invasion, 1979. And I want to emphasize that, and I tell my students that as well. Don't look at it from the lens of what just happened in the last, let's say, 2 months. Look at it through the lens of the chronology of what the Soviets did in Afghanistan, what happened when they pulled out and when we pulled out, when the Cold War political objectives were finished, and we thought that our objectives were achieved. At the time, we also pulled out. We kind of, did what we did. We did back then what we kind of did recently, and that is just, with different circumstances and contexts. But that it's simply, okay, we're out now. And at that time, this is early 1990s, the Afghan warlords and militias, as I mentioned earlier, pointed the guns against each other, and there was a vicious civil war. And there is a risk of that happening now too, or in the near future, and I hope it doesn't, but there is a risk, a real strong risk there. We can talk about that. I really urge everyone to read the 2020 Doha Agreement, Doha, Qatar, where they opened up an office for the Taliban to have official diplomatic talks between mainly the Taliban and the United States. This is a real piece of work, folks. And this is what, along with the Bonn Agreement, but which we can talk about if you like, but this is really what sets off things in terms of the sequence of events. First of all, the anticipation of the change of administration in Washington, D.C., from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, having some sort of forethought about what the Biden administration will have to deal with once this was signed and sealed by both the American delegation and the Taliban delegation in Doha. That's really, in my view, what triggers the events. And then Biden administration has to inherit this and deal with it in its own context, right? But at the same time, abide by most of the stipulations of the Doha Agreement, which include things like recognizing that the Taliban will have some sort of agency. They don't use that word in here, but this is my interpretation, that the Taliban will have political agency. Therefore, this is why they're sending delegates to Doha to engage in diplomatic talks, right? There's a foresight in this. So the Taliban have been given agency. That doesn't mean legitimacy. It just means they have some sort of leverage, some sort of weight that they carry in Afghanistan, even while the previous government was in power, Ashraf Ghani's government at the time, the former president of Ashraf Ghani. By the way, the Doha Agreement completely sidestepped Ashraf Ghani and his government, which we were supposed to be partners with. Okay.
Can you speak to that a little bit? I interviewed the Afghan ambassador to the United Nations, Adela Raz, 2 years ago, and she at the time said, you know, my concern was the Afghan government's cut out of these negotiations with the Taliban. That doesn't sound like that's necessarily a good recipe for the future of Afghanistan. And she had a very diplomatic response at the time. But this was not a secret. The Taliban only wanted to negotiate with the United States because they thought that's where the power was. But didn't that just delegitimize the Afghan government in the eyes of the Afghan people?
And undercut them. And to be fair, a lot of Afghan civilians do not like or did not like the Ashraf Ghani government. And it goes back to what Mark said earlier about so many people support the Taliban in Afghanistan, not because of their Sharia or Islamic legal policy that they enforce violently, but because part of that has to do with law and order, which the Taliban have always been good at. And part of that law and order framework has to do with going after corrupt politicians and going after corrupt militia warlords and going after people who kidnap civilians for ransom and sexually abuse young girls and boys. And so there is that law and order credibility to the Taliban, and that's putting aside all of their abusive behavior towards women and others, right? But putting that aside, the pure law and order piece of it, a lot of Afghans applaud because the Ashraf Ghani, I mean, look at the way he departed. The allegations that he departed with how many multi-millions of dollars, or was it billions of dollars and other things, luxuries that he departed with or escaped with right when Kabul was falling in the hands of the Taliban last month. So, you know, you have to take into account that, yes, we undercut the Ghani government at the time. We actually, by doing that, we undid what we did in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. We undid that. We unraveled that in many ways.
I wonder, I don't want to over prescribe the answer here, but does the Doha Accord, and this is a question that that Kelly asks in the Q&A, does the Doha Accord at least in part explain why the Afghan National Army ultimately folded?
I think so. I think they saw the writing on the wall. Yes. Because anytime you hear news that there are talks going on between the insurgent Taliban and the United States, and they're not including the legitimate Afghan government, how do you think the population of Afghanistan is going to translate that, right? They're not stupid. They're going to put two and two together and they will see the writing on the wall. And that includes the Afghan army and security forces.
Mark, I know that the end of the American war effort in Afghanistan struck you personally, and I wonder if you want to share with our audience some of what your activities were in the month or so after the collapse of Kabul and the evacuation of American forces and their allies.
Sure, happy to some degree. I think that the challenges that some of the specifics I don't feel comfortable getting into yet because we're still trying to get people out.
Sure.
But with that said, and to kind of tie this to the previous question, once the Doha Agreement was signed, the people I was speaking to in Afghanistan were pretty much resigned to the fact that the war was over and the Taliban would win in one of two ways, either militarily and take Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan by force, or there would be such an overwhelming political presence within an Afghan government. No one expected the constitution as it stood to survive, but there'd be such an enormous presence at the result of a Loya Jirga or any sort of elections that it would de facto put them in charge, and they would begin to dismantle the state. I almost said dismantle the administrative state, but that's here, not Afghanistan. In any event, so that's when I noticed, people were trying to make decisions what to do. In fact, why you get so many Americans over there, blue passport holders who end up in Afghanistan when Kabul falls, is a lot of people were going back over to see their families for the last time. We're not going to be able to see you again. This is going to be over. Once the Biden administration makes the decision, and I believe an ill-informed decision, to accept the Doha Agreement, which the Taliban had constantly violated, that creates the speed at which things fall. So between April and August, after April's when you start to see people turn in their weapons, take off their uniforms, start making arrangements to leave. And that's about the time frame people I had worked with, both in the Afghan government and then people who were civilians in Afghanistan. You start to say, oh, I'm coming over. Can you look? At first it starts off, what should I do? Do you think there's a job for me? My SIV paperwork, a special immigrant visa paperwork is stuck. Can you help me with it? And then of course it turns into a nightmare in August. I want to tell a quick story to explain how the effort by not just US military veterans, but by State Department veterans and US Agency for International Development veterans, how this develops. It started off with a phone call. I was calling to find out how one of my old intel team, an Afghan American I worked with and a Canadian Afghan I worked with, how are you doing? Oh, we're still stuck in Kabul. We haven't left yet. What do you mean you haven't left yet? All right, well, do you need help getting out? Yeah, we can't get out. The airport's chaotic. All right, well, let's help you. We'll go buy the commercial flight to get you to Dubai or to Istanbul or wherever we can. That's the first couple of days. I will say that one of my teammates had a little trouble getting to the airport, and it got rather violent. But he finally was able to get in. Then we were able to get his family out a couple of days later. And then the other call comes, hey, do you remember so-and-so who we worked with? Or do you remember the Minister of Parliament that we worked with for all those years? Can you help her family? This sort of steamrolls, and it's not just me, it was hundreds of others whose interpreters and colleagues, whether it was chiefs of staff to the president all the way down to mid-grade military officers, they're asking for help, then their friends are asking for help. And we have to remember, another thing that the Biden administration, I think, has failed with is their understanding of what the nuclear family is in Afghanistan. We think, mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog. In Afghanistan, it's absolutely the parents, and it's absolutely your brother and sister. And so what's happening is everyone's trying to get out to the airport. So these groups of veterans started working together. First it's 5 people, then 20 people. One of the groups I was aware of was well over 700 people, a bit unwieldy, but everyone's trading information and trying to work literally with their contacts using LinkedIn, or, hey, I've got an old Marine Corps buddy who's down in that regiment. They're at the gate. And that's where you see these veterans groups like Task Force Pineapple and EVAC Alliance and all of them who are trying to get the special immigrant visa holders in particular into the airport. That morphs into, after the August 31st, the departure of US forces, into efforts that you see today of getting people out on charter flights out of Mazar-e Sharif, out of Kabul. But it's a mess, Jim. And not only is it did the US government fail to adequately plan for it, and this is really difficult. I'm not just talking about government officials, I'm talking about my friends. I mean, people I've known for my entire career who have utterly fallen on their face over this. Now, granted, things have gotten a little bit better over the last few weeks, but I will tell you that some things that are being done are very clumsy and are impeding the ability of the Afghans to get out. So, if I sound emotionally invested in this, it's because I am. I'm disappointed in my country. I think back to the MS St. Louis in 1939. And sort of the active failure to get European Jews into the United States, and eventually they go back. About 20% of them never make it out of Europe alive. So this administration wanted human rights and women's rights to be at the forefront of its international or its foreign policy program. I'm not sure how they can do that, letting what's happened, and still allowing this to happen in Afghanistan.
Mark and Hayat, this has been a wonderful and rich conversation. I'm going to ask one concluding question in just a moment. There is a really remarkable set of comments and discussion that's been going on in the live chat. Folks, if you haven't had a chance to scroll through some of that, I would encourage you to. Pamela Romano, I'm going to do you the honor, though, of making sure that I note that it sounds to me like you might be a public school teacher, but she notes that public schools are actually trying to encourage students to be critical thinkers before they graduate. I promised her that I would make that point for the audience. Her full comment is there as well. Other great comments from a lot of other participants. Let me end with this question. We'll start with you, Hayat, and then Mark. 20 years after 9/11, 20 years after the start of the war in Afghanistan, in this fall that saw the withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan and the chaos at the airport, what are the principal lessons? What's the legacy of the war, and what are the principal lessons that you think we as a polity and as a people ought to take from this experience? Hayat, let's start with you.
Oh, I don't think we still understand fully other cultures that we tend to send militaries kinetically to engage against. We don't fully understand those cultures. We don't fully understand their ideologies, whether secular or religious. We don't fully understand their cultural concept of time and space. I think these are big lessons that whether you're civilian or military, we have to have some soul searching about that, because we think in terms of American culture, American speed and pace of life, and impatience of what we want to achieve on a daily basis and a long-term basis. We're always in a hurry. That doesn't always happen when we go in to a place like Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else. And the other, I think, lesson is that sometimes we chase our own tail. And regarding this particular 20-year mark of 9/11 and the campaigns, and I say plural campaigns in Afghanistan, starting with 1979 Soviet invasion. When we start to think about or decide policy for yet another military campaign in yet another foreign land, we have failed to think about what we just learned. And we really need to focus on what we've learned from history. We've come full circle. We started out 20 years ago toppling the Taliban, and we've gone beyond full circle, not just full circle, but a few steps further, and actually helping and facilitating the empowerment of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that's a lesson that I think is extremely painful. It's extremely painful. And I hope that people, both in the policy realm and otherwise, take it to heart that our actions have consequences. We were really, really on the right side for self-defense after 9/11 attacks. There's no question about that. But there's a lot to reconsider about what happened afterward. We've come full circle, yes.
Mark.
That's a dissertation. That's a dissertation defense. I want to think about three big things that we need to take away, and we need to explore a bit more to various degrees. Actually, the first is rather simple. War is always going to force us to compromise our values. And if we're not aware of that in the beginning, we are more likely to compromise our values. And I'm speaking specifically about the detention and interrogation practices. We justified it many people justified it a bunch of different ways. It was the wrong thing to do. It was immoral. It was unethical. It's put us in a legal black hole. It makes us look bad. And it's where we go from reluctant hypocrisy to outright hypocrisy. So war forces us to do it. And I think had we understood that in the beginning, whether it was a drift towards abuse or deliberate policies towards abuse, we should have been aware that an attack like that would make us act irrationally, and we have to make sure we don't compromise our values. That's one. But that's war. That's why you don't go to war lightly. Secondly, Clausewitz is alive and well. War is still inextricably linked to politics. So as much as I say it would be great for someone to stand up there and say, this is going to take 20 years, cost $2 trillion, and the lives of thousands of our young men and women, no politician's going to stand up there and say it because they won't get reelected. And so I guess partisan politics and war are inextricably linked. The third thing is about bureaucracy. Robert Comer, who was the special assistant to President Johnson for Vietnam matters, and later, I believe, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, he wrote in 1972 in a famous work called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing about how the U.S. the U.S. institutions, aid, state, and the Department of Defense, for starters, did what was bureaucratically simple and familiar in Vietnam, and it led us down a road to failure. He did not suggest that we could have won the war outright. He noted that there were some serious problems within the Vietnamese system in and of itself that made any sort of, quote, victory unlikely, but that we were our own worst enemy, that we failed as bureaucratic institutions to adapt and change to the reality of the war. And a fellow at the Carnegie Institution, Francis Brown, wrote in, I think, 11 or 12, an article called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, Again, about Afghanistan. That's absolutely right. And whether it's the fact that our military officers working training missions were sort of forced to grade how well the Afghan army was doing based on what would look good in their own fitness reports. In other words, all right, you came in here, everything's red, everything's bad, but by the time you leave, I will guarantee you all those PowerPoint slides read green, that you've done your job. And we create that sort of culture versus measuring things honestly. And there are a host of other cultural things, but they have to do with the way that the Department of Defense was never comfortable with counterinsurgency. They created a wonderful program called Afghan Hands that would give people the linguistic expertise, help them go to Afghanistan multiple times, so we create some cultural competency and an understanding of what we needed to do to partner. The services hated that. They did everything they could to get rid of it. So again, the bureaucracies all do their thing, and if we don't, and we can identify it again, but if we don't learn it, we're just going to do it again the next time.
Hayat Alvi, Mark Jacobson, this has been a wonderful, rich, and provocative conversation. I want to thank you for sharing it with us tonight. To everybody who's been joining us on Facebook, thank you for such great comments and questions. We hope that we'll see you in person in a couple of weeks and virtually again in November. Until then, be well, be safe. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.